Welcome, everyone, to our interfaith relationship conversation. I'd like to begin with a prayer. I put my hand in yours, and together we can do what we could never do alone. No longer must we each depend upon our own unsteady willpower. We are all together now, reaching out our hands for a power and strength greater than ours. Help us to find love and understanding beyond our wildest dreams. Amen. So today, our conversation takes place kind of sandwiched in between two different events. The first that you might not know about is that World Interfaith Harmony Week took place last week and ended on the 8th of February. And today, our event, Love is Love, the first conversation begins. And then after this week comes Valentine's Day. So it's kind of sandwiched in between two really important events. It really comes at an interesting time as well, because in 2010, that World Interfaith Harmony Week was proclaimed by the General Assembly to establish mutual understanding and interreligious dialogue, which are important dimensions in cultivating peace. And as we are talking today, we understand that it's important to enhance that mutual understanding in close relationships, friendships, and future marriages and relationships as well. And if we look across our Duquesne campus, we also realize that there are a lot of people from different faith traditions who come together to study. So we are going to encounter people with different traditions from ours. And even among our own faith traditions, we're going to find differences. We're going to find people whose belief systems are central, but sometimes we might have a bit of opposing views even within our own traditions. You might have come with questions today, and if you do, you can email any of us, and we'd be happy to answer questions. But first of all, we would like to take a look at a conversation that Kallie Crawford, our student government president and third-year law student, and Dr. Ian Edwards, the assistant vice president for student well-being and the director of the counseling center, had earlier today. Kallie, take it over.
Thank you, Linda. I'm going to share this.
Ian Edwards. I'm the assistant vice president for student well-being and also the director of counseling services at Duquesne University of the Holy Spirit. You are in my office right now, 636 Fisher Hall. We're going to talk about interfaith dialogue, but before we do that, just want to talk a little bit about the center itself and just some of the service offerings. So here at the center, this is counseling services. We offer individual counseling, group counseling, outreach, and also workshops. It's free of charge for all students, undergraduate, graduate students. We respond to a wide variety of different types of issues, depression, anxiety, test anxiety, relationship issues, school conflicts, work-life balance, more severe issues such as trauma, personality disorders, eating disorders. We respond to an entire spectrum of different types of issues, and we welcome all people here. Don't think your problem is too small. Don't think your problem is too big. This space, our counselors are hospitable to you and are hospitable to your concerns. So if there are any issues that you need help with, even if you think it's small, come to us. We've got a lot of counselors that are ready and willing to help you. Right now, we're offering most of our services through Zoom. So you can expect that if you have a meeting with a counselor, it's going to be done virtually. If you don't have a space that you feel is confidential, we do have a space here. It's in our interfaith meditation room, and it's a space where you can come. It's a safe space. It's a comfortable space. It's a confidential space. It's a space that you can use to meet privately with your therapist. And so we welcome you. if there are issues or concerns regarding someone that you care about, whether it's a roommate here at the university, a friend of yours, we also have people that can respond to that. So feel free at any time if you have any questions regarding any of our services or concerns about a friend or a loved one, reach out to us.
You just mentioned the Interfaith meditation room. And we just saw that ourselves. How did that room come to exist?
Well, probably around 5 years ago. So at one time, counseling services was located in the 3rd floor of the administration building. Not exactly the best space. So in working with the Vice President of Student Life, we decided that we needed a better space. So the space here in Fisher Hall at one time was the University Law Clinic, and the Interfaith Meditation Room used to be a mock courtroom. So we went in, the space was pretty much perfect for what we wanted to do. So we were able to convert that space. And incidentally, it being a mock courtroom, it was a space of judgment. And we converted that space of judgment to a space of non-judgment, into a space of radical acceptance, into a space of radical hospitality, where people of all faith traditions, people of no faith tradition, could come in and practice a form of meditation, contemplation, prayer that would be congruent with their way of being, congruent with their tradition. It's got a full complement of meditation benches, meditation cushions, prayer beads, malas. It's got images and symbols from all of the religious faiths. And it's designed to communicate to people, students, faculty, and staff, that it's a place of welcome, that regardless of your tradition, you are welcome here, and you can practice the spiritual path of your choosing. And what we know about spiritual practice is that it works. It's empirically validated. Meditation and prayer can foster states of well-being and happiness like no other path can. So we believe very firmly at Counseling Services and the Center for Student Wellbeing as a whole that integral to your well-being is spiritual practice. So if you go into the meditation room, again, you'll see different images of the divine, right? You'll see an image of Christ. You'll see an image of the Buddha. You'll see an image of Krishna, Radha, the all-attractive divine coupled together. You'll see the 99 names of God in Islam. You'll see the Hebrew tree of life, right? You'll see different meditation benches, all of that. The one thing that could be there, that's not there, is actually a mirror, right? Because what we're ultimately trying to do is to show people and for them to experience that when they enter that space, that these images are not just objects of adoration and worship, but they're pointing to and teaching the practitioner who and what they truly are. So if a mirror was to be there, and let's say you were to look into that mirror, you will see reflecting back to you an image of yourself. But then if you look around and you see the images of the divine, what you know at that moment is that that image of you looking back at you is also an image of the divine. It's a presentation of God, of goddess, of sacredness, of holiness, of a mystery. And so in that space, we want people to come to the realization of who they truly are and who they were created to be in the image and likeness of the divine. And they too, you too, are divine. And that is what we believe to be a person's vocation, their calling, is to come to a realization of who they truly are.
How does a student, faculty, or staff member go about reserving that space now?
So that's easy. You can reach out to us, 412-396-6204, and you're going to talk with one of our triage counselors, one of our case managers, and they will be able to reserve that space for you. So all you would have to do is just specify the day and time that you want to come in. They reserve that space. Let's say it's Monday at 11 and it's available. That's your space. That's your time. You can do that as an individual, and you can also do that as a group. But again, right now, because of COVID, we're not really having the room open. But when we can, we want to reopen that room and then welcome people to come in and reserve that space, either individuals or as groups. If you're unfamiliar with meditation, if you're unfamiliar with different prayer practices, we can facilitate workshops for you. We have a number of staff members who could lead an individual or a small group in introductory meditation, introductory mindfulness, contemplative prayer that might be congruent with your tradition.
Now, if two people who are of different faith find themselves in that room together, how would you suggest that they start an interfaith dialogue between them?
See, we hope that happens actually. And for one, when that has happened before and when it will happen again, that's a beautiful event, because that's when you have one person being given an opportunity to encounter someone else. And so let's say you have someone in the Catholic tradition that might be praying the rosary silently to him or herself, next to someone from the Hindu tradition that might be praying a prayer to Shiva, Om Namah Shivaya, and they're doing that silently. At first, it might be a little uncomfortable because you might be hearing a language, you might be hearing the name of the deity that is unfamiliar to you. But I would sit in a space of curiosity, of wonder, or even awe in terms of what you're hearing. And if you look over to your right or to your left, depending on where that person is, when the time is right, when that prayer meditation is over, simply reach out and ask, hey, that's a prayer that I don't recognize. That's a meditation that I don't recognize. That's a prayer bead that I don't recognize. Tell me a little bit more about that. Even if you're anxious and asking, fearful and asking, reach out in a state of wonder and allow the other to inform you. And what you're going to end up finding is that if you open yourself up to this interfaith, interspiritual dialogue, that there are going to be more similarities than differences, because all of those images and symbols of the divine that are in that interfaith meditation are all masks or presentations of the one divine being. And that's the idea that we're really trying to get across, that despite the difference in appearances, that all of those images point to the one divine being that is common to all traditions.
So if students find themselves in this conversation, but in the conversation they come to a point where both of their religions have very opposing views on one factor or one part of the religion, how do they continue that relationship and that communication to get past that significant difference? Is there a way to get past that difference?
Well, there are differences, right? And so, the differences oftentimes really exist on that superficial, cultural, even ritualistic kind of level. And so you've got differences in language, you've got differences in scripture text. You have differences in the types of traditions and rites, right? So those differences are going to exist. But part of that is what makes these traditions beautiful as well, is that they are, at least on the surface, radically different, philosophically and spiritually underneath the same. And so practicing this form of radical acceptance, radical hospitality, which is really what that room communicates, doesn't mean that everybody has to agree. It doesn't mean that the traditions themselves, at least on the surface, are all pointing to the same thing. And so we want people to be able to coexist in that space of difference, but have a fundamental respect for the being of that other person, for the dignity of that other person, and that because you're in different spaces, because you represent different traditions and have radically different cultures, even if you don't understand at first what that tradition signifies, I invite you to learn more about it. So much can be remedied in terms of education, right? So we have a wide variety of spiritual texts that students, faculty, and staff can check out. And so if you're finding that in the conversation, there are radically different rites, there are radically different forms of practice, there are different holy days. One tradition may be monotheistic, the other tradition might be polytheistic. One person might subscribe to no faith and say that they're a avowed atheist. The idea is to learn as much as you can about these different traditions and to get an understanding of where they come from, even if you disagree with it. The goal is not for a Catholic to become a Hindu, or a Hindu to become a Catholic, or a Buddhist to become a Christian, or a Jew to become a Sufi. We're not interested in that. But what we're ultimately interested in is that people of different faiths having a respect for each other's traditions, a respect for one another, and at the same time being open to enlighten themselves. And so if a Christian can come in there and become a better Christian, a Catholic can come in there and become a better Catholic, and the same with the Buddhist, the Hindu, the Jew, the practitioner of Islam, or any other faith tradition, or the atheist can come in and learn mindfulness skills to improve his or her well-being. That's the overall objective. And that the common good is achieved when we each promote one another's well-being. And we know that spiritual practice is an important path to that.
So after having this rich dialogue and conversation, do you think that there's a way for them to safely leave that space of the meditation room and take it out to the real world and also coexist there as well?
That for me is probably the most important part of that. And so in that space of meditation, in that space of dialogue, in that space of being not just open to diversity, but radically open to diversity, where this radical openness to diversity leads to this hospitality, this openness. So in that space, in that safe, contemplative, meditative space where this dialogue might occur, where those seeds are planted, you go out into the world and you see an even wider array of diverse images, ideas, and presentations, even in nature, that exists, right? And so we want people just not to appreciate a diversity of forms, a diversity of appearances, but a diversity of ideas, right? And so you can have many people that look different, but their only commonality is that they all agree. And so it's much more challenging to run into a diverse idea that you might disagree with on some level, or you're not at home with on some level. But the idea there is to develop compassion, develop empathy, to develop insight, so that you see that in relation to religious or spiritual diversity, that path for that person is conducive toward their well-being. And so this isn't about like converting people to a particular dogma, but it's about encouraging people to practice the tradition that's going to bring them the greatest amount of well-being and bring them closer to God, to bring them closer to the divine, right? And so what we know in psychology is that if you pursue comfort as your path, if you pursue happiness as your path, you're not going to find it. It's the last thing you will find if that's your goal. But what we know is that through spiritual practice, through a connection with the divine source, or even a person's authentic or genuine self, they will ultimately find the comfort, the peace, and the well-being that they're looking for. And from that realization, they will encourage others to do the same and learn to look past the different masks of God and see the divine that underlies everything, including nature.
So out in the world, we know that we're going to run into those people who just don't want to have that conversation with us, that don't want to respect each other on a human level. What would you say to the people trying to keep to them, like keep who they are, keep to themselves, true to themselves, and continuing to trying to cultivate those kinds of interfaith dialogues and relationships, even though there are outside stressors or judgments that are being placed on them?
Right, and there will be, right? And so, people that are holistically or integrally minded, right, are not the majority. Some statistics say at most 5% of the population is truly holistically minded. And so you will probably encounter more judgment, more discrimination, more misunderstanding than you would hope. But that shouldn't deter you. That shouldn't stop you. People are at different phases on their paths, right? And so some people, they're not ready for this kind of conversation. They might be very new to their faith, right? Or they might be in their faith in such a way in that it protects their fears, right? So any confrontation with otherness, any confrontation with difference, or something might challenge what they've used to help them navigate through different fears, might be perceived as threatening. And just as Jesus said when he was on the cross, he looked down to those that were responsible directly and indirectly for crucifying them and said, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." And so there's a way in which, when people might even say hurtful things, when people might be judging you in a way that is harmful, they're doing so out of ignorance. They're doing so out of not knowing. And so the idea is, if you're met with any kind of resistance in the world, stay true to who you are and stay true to this idea that equity, diversity, and inclusion, all peoples, all ideas, is something that's authentic, is something that's genuine, and something that's ultimately holy. And as you put this idea out into the cosmos, you're going to attract people that are of like mind. And when you find those that are of like mind, even if it's just 2 people, even if it's just 3 people, that's community. And so you want to continue to have these dialogues and think of creative ways where you can outreach to people, that might have a different mindset. But ultimately, though, if someone is resistant, if someone is not in that space where they might be receptive to this, you have to let that be. You have to let that go. And you hope and pray that at some point they might come around, and that through their own enlightenment and through their own path, wherever that might take them, they might see the authenticity in what you've been trying to message to them.
Now, taking that relationship between 2 individuals, having this conversation kind of to the next level, say in a romantic sense, what would you say to someone who is in a romantic relationship with someone of a different faith or no faith at all? Is that a sustainable relationship? Are they going to be able to get married? How would they raise their kids? Like all of those issues and questions that could come to light, what would you say to those people that are currently in that situation?
Sure, and more people are in those types of situations where they might be involved in a romantic relationship with someone of another faith or someone of no faith, right? And so these situations are happening more frequently. But I would say there's a way in which, people of different faith traditions that come together, or one from a faith tradition and one from another faith tradition, can really in some way enhance each other's lives, as opposed to, just having people of the same tradition come together. And it's important to have this conversation. What are the similarities in our perspectives? What are the similarities in worldviews? And so if you strip down a religious tradition and you just say it's a worldview, it's a way in which I appropriate self, world, and other. There's a system of ethics, there's a system of morality that's attached to that, right? And so having this conversation with your significant other about what their worldview signifies. Now, each person has a certain set of values. Some of those values can be compromised, they can be bended a little bit, and some cannot. And so if you're in a conversation with someone, and this happens to be a romantic partner, and it's in the earlier phase of the relationship, and it's clear that your worldviews have some differences. But I would say this exists even with people in the same tradition as well. It's often assumed that there's similarity, but when in fact there's actually not. And unfortunately, people might realize that down the line. But in the very beginning, identify the similarities and differences. Now, if those differences are differences that you can be receptive to and ultimately learn from and even appropriate in some way, then that's okay. But if there's a way in which some of these differences go against or contradict a value or a value system that you feel is not flexible, then that's something that you want to talk more with your partner, because it's possible that in order for the relationship to work, one partner is going to have to make a significant compromise, and that wouldn't bode well for the relationship down the line. Even if that couple has children, there would be a confused value system that might get imparted to them. And it doesn't have to be the case that the value system that people will have to be entirely agreed on. But in terms of ethics, in terms of living the good life, what is the greater good? How do I pursue happiness? How do I pursue treating other people? How do I integrate work? And how do I integrate relationships into my understanding of self, world, and other, right? And so there's a way in which people can come to a common consensus as to what they believe to be the good life is. And so this kind of boils down to ethics in some way. And so people of different traditions can have, on the surface, very different or seemingly very different perspectives. But if they agree on how to live the good life, if they agree in terms of what values or system of values that they want to expose their children to, then that can certainly be workable. But you have people of different traditions that can come together, and there are many children that can represent the best of both traditions. Who says they have to identify with one or the other? There's a way in which they can appropriate the best of both traditions, and there are many that actually do that, and it's quite successful.
Oh, thank you so much.
Wow, Kallie, that was an awesome conversation. And I think there were a lot of points covered that were really help us to open our eyes to what we need to do to come to an understanding. And that idea of radical acceptance is something that not all people can do in relationships. So I'd like to move to the next part where we talk to one of our favorite guests. Before we get into that, though, quickly, there's a couple different ways to look at relationships. If there's a relationship, couples with one or more religious member to whom religion is important and whose religious investment will determine the direction in which the religious practice of the family will go. That's one kind of relationship. Another one might be couples who are equally religious, where both people have really strong commitments to the perpetuation of their investments in their practice and in their home. And then another scenario might be couples where each member has a primarily an identity, family-based affiliation with a faith tradition, but really no strong investment in claims or traditions for their own sake. So let's find out, let's discover a relationship that Dr. Luci-Jo DiMaggio has. I'd like to introduce her. I don't think she needs an introduction. I think everyone knows who Dr. DiMaggio is. And we would like to first ask, before you talk about your relationship, tell us about your background, how you were raised in your faith.
Sure. It's just LJ, right? It's not Dr. I mean, it is, but just LJ.
It's Dr. DiMaggio, but to us it's LJ.
People have no idea who Dr. DiMaggio is, but they might know LJ.
Okay.
So I was raised as a cradle Catholic, went to Catholic school, was in a community with a lot of immigrants from Europe, Eastern and Western Europe, but a really strong Catholic population. I grew up in a little steel town, or rather outside of a little steel town, and we supported 3 Catholic schools and 3 Catholic parishes and a Catholic high school in a town that was about this big. So that influenced my world very much. And that was how I had grown up. I came to Duquesne as an undergraduate and really pursued a lot of things that kind of, for me, helped sort of find my footing in my faith a little more as an adult. So that's sort of, that was what you were asking, sort of the background there a bit, yeah?
Okay, so, from your tradition, what are some of the beliefs that you hold really important and that you find you might not be able to compromise in thinking?
Particularly in my adult, I guess after I came to Duquesne, I really sort of found my faith as it was very personal to me, and also how I interacted with my faith community. The heart for me was in gospel justice, was around social justice and dignity of the human person, ideas of subsidiarity, all of the high points really of Catholic social teaching really meant a lot to me. And that was where I expressed my faith, and that was where I felt closest to my faith. And those have always kind of been non-negotiables. If there's a non-negotiable for me with my faith, it's most of the ideals of Catholic social teaching.
Okay, so when we talk about relationships, a lot of people don't discuss faith differences until they actually get into the talk of marriage. And then all of a sudden we have to have that conversation. So before your wedding, did you and your husband discuss your faith differences? And if not, when did they come up?
So I saw that question. I thought, that we hit that way before then. So my husband, when I met him as an atheist. Depending on the day you catch him, he'll tell you he's an atheist or an agnostic, but he shifted a little more towards agnosticism, I think, since our children were born. But because when we met, I was an undergraduate and I was very active in my faith. And then by the time we married, I was a Catholic youth minister. So it would have been hard to escape the fact, of talking about it until there's no way we would have waited that long, just because it was sort of something I talked about kind of as a part of my daily life. So we talked about a lot of the biggies before we got married. So we talked about faith, and we talked about the nuts and bolts of the wedding as well, but we talked about kids and how we were going to raise kids and different things like that. And some of those deal breakers, like what are those things you cannot just give ground on? And because Jason that's my husband's name, Jason could absolutely wrap his head around on an intellectual level, even as an atheist, the concepts of social justice. He was like, yes, okay, I can get on board with these pieces. So we found a lot of similarities, even though I came at mine from a gospel perspective and he came at his more from an intellectual common good, what we would call now, we've been married a long time, this word wasn't a word, I don't think, when we got married, a humanist perspective.
So how about extended families? Did those come into play at all? Like when you were planning your wedding or anything, or any issues with extended families now in the practice?
Not so for the wedding planning, not in particular, mainly because I married one of the easiest going human beings ever to be born. So it was sort of like, yeah, that sounds good. And the question we kept asking is, are we going to be married in the end? Yes, I'm fine with it. And so that solved a lot of problems. There really wasn't, Jason's the only child of an only child, so he doesn't have a ton of extended family. His extended family is largely Lutheran. Jason was actually raised Lutheran, baptized, confirmed Lutheran, and nobody had a problem with the fact that I was Catholic. My family, being who they are, I come from a big Duquesne family, probably had a bigger problem with the fact he was a Pitt grad. They were like, oh, he went to Pitt? Okay, like they got on board with all sorts of other things, and that was a little bit more of a sticking point for them. But that was never a huge issue for us. And that's not to say we didn't have our challenges and problems. We did. It's just that extended family wasn't necessarily one of them. And I do think a part of that was because we echoed that in our relationship. We were like, we're fine with this, so we're assuming you all are. We didn't, reflect, oh, this is a big problem, or, I don't think that sort of came, we never, because it wasn't the case. And we also never projected anything like that. And I think that made a big difference in how our extended family perceived us.
So how about your children? How do you raise your children? In which faith? How? Both traditions? How does that go?
I have a 12 and a 14-year-old. And before we were even married, we had talked about, because Jason was raised Lutheran, he was a big proponent of the fact that you need some sort of basis. He felt strongly about that helped inform his choices as an adult, that you had to have a starting point, that it almost, for him and for me, it didn't seem fair to sort of launch people out and say, figure it out. Not that that was a choice we made for us. We don't think that's necessarily right for everybody, but that was what we felt was right for us. And because I was already a Catholic campus minister at that point when we started having kids, I moved into campus ministry at that point. Jason never really had a problem when I had said, I want to raise our kids Catholic. And he was like, yep, no problem. And our kids were in Catholic school actually up until this year. They just moved for the first time to public school. But it was never a big deal. I don't think when they were little. It was just daddy doesn't go to church, but daddy comes on Easter and Christmas because we all get dressed up and that's what we do as a family. And as they got older, and Linda, you raised boys, you know this, when you start getting the, why do I have to get out of bed to go to church phase? It's like, wait a second. Dad stays home and cleans the house while we're at church. I'll help clean, right? So they started to push back. So then we talked openly, like my kids can both tell you, oh yeah, my dad's agnostic. And we've both, and it's really helpful. I would say one big pro tip was that to have both spouses on the same page. Jason and I have always said the same thing. When you're 18 and you're not in this house, even if you're 18 and when you graduate from high school, the choice is yours. We want you to do what makes your heart happy. If that's Catholicism, that's great. If it's another faith, that's fine. If you really feel like what dad believes around agnosticism is what fits for you, that's fine. The non-negotiables have been the non-negotiables since the beginning. It's still, but you're not going to be a jerk and you're going to contribute to the common good. And for your part, you're going to attempt to make the world a little better place and stay informed. And where you get those from is up to you, but that's our hope for, I think, our children in the end, knowing that they might find different paths.
Okay, now challenges.
Yeah.
Can you think of like a challenge that you faced and how you overcame it? Because I think that's important to understand.
Yeah, I think it really, gratefully, by the time we had kids, we had knocked out a lot of the problems. I think it was more, Jason and I like to have kind of heady discussions around things. He's very, very bright. And that was one of the things that's very attractive to me. I love to have kind of fun conversations with him. But we would talk about faith and I were talking about things that were meaningful to me. And he would be like, I'm glad that's meaningful to you. That doesn't make any sense to me. What you're saying makes no sense. And nothing you're going to say is going to convince me otherwise. And I'd be like, all right, well, I'm not trying to convince you. I'm expressing my, and we would kind of go round about that until we figured out better ways to articulate our points. I think it wasn't really that any of us ever gave ground. Neither of us are very good at that. We compromise in our relationship, but when it comes to things that are really meaningful to us, it more was about how we were communicating. Both of us needed to learn how to communicate. And that was really what was causing most of the challenges, was not communicating as best as we could to one another in ways that what we were saying was how our words landed. And I would say, is moving down the line, I think the only other challenge I would say, it's more of a challenge for me than Jason, is when I've had kind of I don't want to say faith crises, but crises in my faith, right? You know, we all go through those. I think if you say you don't, you're probably fibbing to yourself. But, you know, kind of just really things that have rocked my faith. And it's not that I can't talk to him about that. And it's not that he won't listen, but he can really only respond from an intellectual place. And he does, he responds with empathy, but in a very intellectual way. And so then as a response to that, I have a couple of small faith journey groups I'm a part of. He's totally cool with it. We host them sometimes at our house. He's like, that's fine. What are we cooking? You know, I'll help do whatever. And so that has helped me. Sorry, that was my alarm to remind me my next thing. I'm okay. I got 5 more minutes. I was prepping my stuff while that video was rolling. So I got about 5 minutes, but yeah, so that it was important for me to find those people that I was really, really close to as an adult that were in the same space as I was, that were raising children, that were around my kids' age, that were trying to figure this out, that were going through some of the same kind of crisis stuff that I was, to be able to say, you know, where are you on this? Or how do you feel about this? To kind of get that response.
So the last question I'll ask so we can wrap up is, what are the main things you would like students to take away from you know, your experience and from our conversation today?
In interfaith,
best tips
of any kind, whether they're romantic or friend or any sort of close relationship you have, I would say communication is key. And remembering that communication just isn't you word vomiting everything in your head on the other person. It's important to say what you're thinking, but I can't stress enough the importance of learning, particularly with your life partner, how to communicate, particularly around this if you're in an interfaith relationship. So are you articulating what you're feeling in a way that is understood and digestible by the other person? That might not be the way you're used to articulating it. And that might not be, it might be harder and more frustrating for you to articulate that in a way that he or she understands that. But I would say that is the biggest thing, is stay in open communication about it. The places I've seen this fail in other places and other couples is when the response to this is, I don't talk about my faith. I'm thinking, but why? Like, you know, I just think that can be so damaging and make you feel so isolated in your faith. And also feel like, I don't know how I could translate my faith to my kids if it was something I felt like I couldn't talk about with my husband or in my house. If it was like, oh, we have to be, you know, we're talking about faith stuff right now. And I would just say communication and understanding, learning through trial and error and sometimes fighting and figuring that out, but communicating around that and learning how to best communicate around that.
And I think basically the love connection is what really makes you want to do that and makes that communication even more important.
Yeah. And find what your deal, like, I don't think you called them deal breakers, but you said, you know, find those things that are really important to you. Sometimes finding those pieces and figuring out how to articulate those things that are most meaningful to you can make a big difference and is often a great starting point.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. If you need to jump off, you can.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This was fun.
We appreciate it. Thanks. I just want to close with, Kallie, do you want to share with the audience what the other events that are coming up this week? I will share that tonight at 6 p.m. If you are on Monday, February 8th, we will be having a moving and discussion 6 to 7 p.m. On Zoom, and it's on Instagram to get the Zoom login. Kallie, the other events?
Yeah, of course. So tomorrow we have our LGBTQIA+ love events. First, starting at noon, we have our SOGI presentation, which will be presented by one of our very own students here on campus. Her name is Rosie, and she is the president of the Education Initiative on Individual Diversity. And then in the evening at 6 p.m., that same organization will be hosting an LGBTQIA+ trivia night. Both of those events will be taking place on Zoom, and all of that login can be found on all of our social medias for the Student Government Association. Then on Wednesday, we really turn into ourselves and focus on self-love with a self-compassion workshop at noon with Dr. Amy Horton, followed by various breakout sessions in the evening. starting at 6 with things like yoga classes, a Zoom class, HIIT class, dietitian class, and finally also offering a Who Am I session with Christina, which is essentially a presentation regarding how we view ourselves and how we view ourselves in the world as a whole. For those different events, I would say please, please, please check the advertisements for those events, because some of them do start a little bit before 6 or a little after 6. So really make sure you look at the time for whichever one of those breakout sessions you do want to attend Wednesday night. Then on Thursday, we are talking about good versus bad love. And we will have a healthy relationships presentation with Annie Soa and Dr. Dan Gittins. And then in the evening, we will have a book club session at 6 p.m. where students will have the opportunity to read a piece, a journal excerpt on good versus bad love and healthy relationships. And then we'll have an open forum discussion on reactions, thoughts, feelings to what we had just read. And then closing out this week on Friday, we have our Love is Love variety show at 6 p.m. where we're asking students to sign up to participate in the event live. But if you can't, we also have on the sign up form a place where you can pre-submit any kind of works that you would like to have displayed at the variety show for that evening. And really what we're looking for there in your content submission is just how you express love to yourself. How do you show it to others? And, you know, maybe how should we be showing love to ourselves and others if we aren't at that necessary ideal place yet. So thank you for the shout out with all of the other events coming up this week, Linda. Hand it back to you.
Okay, so thank you for being with us. We hope that you found some helpful suggestions and some inspiration that can take you forward in your relationships. So that's it. We'll see you next time.